Let's get to something that you and I touched on 2 weeks ago, which is, some concerns about civil liberties and how they could be violated by an incoming Biden presidency. Now that he is president, it's pretty clear that he is in fact planning on doing something about domestic terrorism and domestic extremism, and that could mean some losses for regular people like us. So let's discuss. President Joe Biden, like many in the country, is concerned about violent extremists, right-wing gangs, militias, the type of people who decided to storm the Capitol and engage in riots when Congress was supposed to be certifying electoral votes for Joe Biden. Now, there's some concern that Biden is going to focus the security state on rooting out violent extremists in the country. And, the press secretary for the Biden White House has clarified that that is, in fact, the case. They are going to rely heavily on gathering intelligence, using the intelligence community in order to have the data and identify exactly who falls under their category of domestic extremists. And, of course, that surveillance is going to be done by agencies like the FBI, which, if you've been paying attention to the history of the FBI, there have been all sorts of issues with the tactics they've engaged in, tactics that violate our civil liberties. But that's even the case in recent history. In fact, back in 2015, the FBI was indiscriminately spying on the American people without them even knowing about it. The Associated Press broke the story at the time. Here are the details.
The Associated Press has learned that the FBI has been using scores of low-flying airplanes with high-tech imaging devices, all registered to fictitious companies.
People for years, if going back more than a decade, have been concerned when they see these low-flying airplanes circling above their house, so much so that some people even call 911 and ask the police, who is this person circling above?
The AP traced at least 50 aircraft back to the FBI, including this single-engine Cessna spotted at a regional airport in Northern Virginia.
The key thing on that aircraft is that if you look on the left-hand side, there's like a white basketball-looking object. And what that is a camera. So when the plane makes a 90-degree, or rather left-hand turns going around a certain area, the camera is off to the side recording as the aircraft is sweeping over a certain maybe 2-mile radius.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic. And the reason why this was, I want to say a big story, but it barely got any attention. But the reason why it was a story at all is because the FBI, of course, was not disclosing to the American people that they were indiscriminately being spied on. And when you look at the communities that the FBI was honing in on, the protests that broke out in response to the death of Freddie Gray in police custody was one of the targets, right? And so there's a worry about this intelligence gathering that targets people who have legitimate concerns about policing, legitimate concerns about inequality in the country. It could be thought of, and I do think of it, as a form of intimidation. If you know that Big Brother is watching and spying on you, you might be less inclined to engage in a movement that could catch their attention and lead to more surveillance of your personal life. And so there are, of course, certainly issues with these government agencies. However, things get even trickier and shadier once there is a relationship with the public and private sector. Because, of course, as we know, the private sector brings along its own challenges due to a very clear profit motive. So, much like any marketplace, if there is a profit motive behind beefing up the security state, you better believe that we'll be beefing up the security state. And that was already happening before Biden came into office. And so let's pivot over to private surveillance and something that is impacting communities already. So there is a public safety committee in St. Louis, and they just passed a surveillance measure that relies on the use of these so-called spy planes that would hover over heads over the heads of every single person living in that community. And it's such a far-reaching form of surveillance that everyone should be concerned about this. So Board Bill 200, according to a local Fox affiliate, proposed a contract between the city of St. Louis and the company Persistent Surveillance Systems, As if that name isn't creepy enough, persistent surveillance systems. They would provide aerial pictures that would help track movements after a crime is committed. Now, this is something that has already been implemented in other parts of the country, and it's been incredibly opaque. But getting back to St. Louis, the camera proposal calls for flights to occur up to 18 hours a day using 3 planes. The aircraft would use wide-angle cameras to capture images of up to 32 square miles a second. Now, the technology was created by a former U.S. Air Force officer, because of course it was, and the gentleman's name is Ross McNutt. That's his real name. And there's a little bit of an explanation of what his technology does in this next video. Enjoy.
We believe that this will revolutionize policing.
McNutt is an Air Force veteran whose company in Ohio, Persistent Surveillance Systems, wants to roll out the battlefield technology in U.S. cities after he developed it for the military in Iraq.
This is actually the camera system here.
This Cessna is equipped with 12 powerful cameras. It can hover more than a mile above a city for hours at a time, capturing everything in public view.
We'll take the picture of a city, 32 square miles of a city, once a second at resolutions that we can just barely follow a person to and from a crime scene where they came from before the crime, even though we may not have known that crime was going to be committed.
Once someone calls police and reports a crime, technicians can zoom in on a recording of a particular area, essentially turning back the clock to look for evidence.
Are these spy planes?
We can call them community support planes.
Oh, community support planes. That's a really interesting way of framing something that tracks our every move, in most cases without communities even knowing about it. And unfortunately, this has been tested in other parts of the country that are still considering contracting this company for more surveillance. So in Baltimore, for instance, there was a pilot program that had all sorts of issues. It was written about by Baltimore Magazine. I highly recommend this piece. Prying eyes, military-grade surveillance keeps watch over Baltimore and city protests, but catches few criminals. And we'll get to the efficacy of this, civil liberties issue in just a second. But there were a lot of problems with the program. For instance, there was a lack of accurate data to, either boast its efficacy or show that it isn't effective. There was also a lack of transparency for the community. People living in Baltimore had no idea that this program was being implemented and that their every move was being tracked by these spy planes. Also, there were concerns about data leaks from this private company, Persistent Surveillance. And what exactly is the surveillance focusing on? Is it actually focusing on crime, or is it also surveilling people who engage in public protests? Now, after more than 700 hours aloft over the city, just one arrest has been made with aid from the program's imagery data, according to the Baltimore Police Department. Meanwhile, major Black Lives Matter protests have been among public street activities widely captured and recorded. And just how effective are these spy planes? Let's watch.
This is one of our aircraft. It's the one we're using here in Baltimore. This is our camera system. It's 192 million pixels, which makes it about equivalent to 800 video cameras at once. And everything is fed down to the ground live through our data links here. We do wide area surveillance. We watch cities at a time in order to assist law enforcement in lowering crime rates. We're essentially a Google Earth Live with TiVo capability that allows us to follow people to and from crime scenes.
Yeah, but how effective is it? I mean, the Baltimore Police Department said that this helped, solve one crime. And unfortunately, McNutt is not very forthcoming when it comes to any data regarding the efficacy of the technology that he's pushing on various cities throughout the country. So McNutt argues that the system could reduce crime in Baltimore by up to 30%. But there's no research to back up that claim, only a 2017 review by the National Police Foundation recommending further study. further study. So there's no organization and there's no data indicating that it would help decrease crime by 30%. The residents of Baltimore, by the way, as I've said before, and I want to say it again, didn't even know that they were being surveilled in this way. Persistence Surveillance Systems trial in Baltimore was only disclosed to the public 2 weeks after its initial phase was completed, which led to an uproar and backlash for good reason. People should know that there's a private company spying on them with the help of their local government. And what made the situation worse for people living in Baltimore was that their data was in fact being leaked by persistent surveillance to the press in an effort to, push positive PR about the private company. The Baltimore Police Department called them out on this, and they threatened to end a controversial aerial surveillance program, claiming that serious breaches of confidentiality were jeopardizing the city's relationship with the Ohio-based company. Police, by the way, also said that they received repeated requests from the media to corroborate information about the program allegedly shared by Persistent Surveillance Systems, despite Police Chief of Staff Eric Melancon telling owner Ross McNutt multiple times that such information needed to be signed off on by the department. Now, the Baltimore Police Department also wrote a pretty strongly worded letter to McNutt, and they argued that the continuing failure to maintain the confidentiality of unverified data relating to the aerial investigation research program, and specifically the unwillingness to abide by repeated instructions that the Baltimore Police Department must approve all public communications, I should say, is disturbing. And of course, the ACLU has weighed in on this and has been fighting the implementation of these spy planes throughout the country. They did release a statement saying, unlike lawful forms of aerial surveillance, the warrantless air program subjects plaintiffs and virtually all of Baltimore's 600,000 residents to long-term, wide area, and indiscriminate surveillance that will capture the whole of an individual's movements and thereby reveal their privacies of life. This surveillance is inescapable, and revelation of private information to the air program is involuntary. Short of never leaving home, when the planes are in the air, there's no way to avoid defendants' surveillance system. And what's also concerning is just how often this very technology has been implemented in our country. How many cities have already engaged with this type of program? There's more details on that in the next video.
We've started off in Philadelphia at one point. We did operations here in Baltimore previously. We've done operations in Indianapolis, Compton, Nogales, Torreon, Charlotte, and now we're back here in Baltimore, and we hope to be here forever.
Now, of course he hopes to be there forever. I mean, we're talking about a man who's pushing a technology that he could make a lot of money from. And there are some cities that decided to give McNutt the middle finger, including Los Angeles, where I live. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which by the way has its own issues, and McNutt's planes tried wide area surveillance over Compton, California without notifying residents or elected leaders. In 2014, he pitched Dayton the idea, but ran into stiff civil liberties opposition from the community. Now, I have all sorts of issues with Los Angeles, especially since they engaged previously, but there has been enough of a backlash that luckily, it seems unlikely that McNutt's technology will be implemented again in the city. But what's important is that people are informed about this program. So they're not left in the dark about this public-private partnership to essentially encroach on their civil liberties. But more often than not, by the way, McNutt uses this argument of cost saving in order to persuade community leaders and local politicians to do these pilot programs, to do test trials of these spy planes. And here's an example of him making that case in a fairly recent interview.
For a year of surveillance, Ross charges about $2 million. But that's less than the cost of flying a police helicopter.
Baltimore will have 3 planes flying over different parts of the city during daylight hours. McNutt argues his system is cheaper and more effective than a police helicopter, and that the visual evidence can be used in court.
So it's possible in some cases this might help exonerate people.
Absolutely.
For now, private donors are financing this experiment. If it's successful, more communities could soon find themselves under a watchful eye.
Oh, we'll get to those private donors in just a second. But McNutt's argument makes me think of private prisons, because it's the same argument that they make when they convince various municipalities to move away from publicly funded and publicly controlled prisons to focus more on privately run prisons, which, by the way, are also publicly funded. And private prisons have all sorts of issues, including being incredibly abusive, and they engage in human rights abuses against inmates. And so this argument of, oh, we're going to save you a lot of money is ridiculous, especially when you consider the fact that beefing up the surveillance state doesn't actually address the root causes of violence and violent crime in cities across the country. In fact, during the 1990s, when Joe Biden had pitched his disastrous crime bill, Bernie Sanders, who was in the House of Representatives at the time, got on the House floor and he gave an incredibly strong speech arguing why the crime bill, essentially criminalizing people, was the wrong way to address violent crime in America. Here's a little taste of what he had to say.
A society which neglects, which oppresses, and which disdains a very significant part of its population, which leaves them hungry, impoverished, unemployed, uneducated, and utterly without hope, will, through cause and effect, create a population which is bitter, which is angry, which is violent, and a society which is crime-ridden. And that is the case in America, and it is the case in other countries throughout the world.
And Bernie is absolutely right about that. He was right back in the 1990s. He makes similar arguments today. And there is a lot of data showing the correlation between poverty and high crime rates. So for instance, there was a fairly recent study done by 24/7 Wall Street, and they found that the cities with the highest violent crime rates tend to share other socioeconomic characteristics, notably a lack of economic opportunity. In the vast majority of cities on this list, and they did provide a pretty extensive list, poverty and unemployment rates are higher than they are nationwide. Often these cities, by the way, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, often these cities are former manufacturing hubs clustered in the industrial Midwest. Cities in Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio have all been affected by the decline of American manufacturing and now have some of the highest crime rates in the country. And I'll give you one specific example. This study, by the way, was done a few years ago, so clearly it was before the pandemic. But I am very curious to see how poverty linked to this pandemic has further exacerbated these statistics. But nonetheless, let me give you the example of Dayton, Ohio. There were about 922 violent crimes for every 100,000 people in Dayton, Ohio in 2018, well more than double the national violent crime rate of 369 per 100,000 people. Crime is often higher in areas with limited economic opportunity. In Dayton, 32.7% of the population lives below the poverty line, more than double the national poverty rate of 14.6%. But as we've seen over and over again, rather than address why crime happens in the first place, we engage in this vicious cycle of turning to private industry to try to solve the symptoms of a virus that's been impacting this country for decades now. And local politicians, much like Joe Biden, just want to beef up the security state. And that is not going to help us. If anything, it's going to violate whatever rights we have left pertaining to our, civil liberties and our privacy. So the pilot program, by the way, in St. Louis is not going to cost $2 million. It's going to cost a lot more than that. So some of the figures that you hear McNutt share with the public are inaccurate anyway. The pilot program in St. Louis would be a 3-year trial that would cost an estimated $7.5 to $10 million. But the test run will not be publicly funded. It will be funded by private donors who are shady as hell. Private donors who honestly see this as more of an investment to make more money in the future. So it will be funded by Arnold Ventures. They refer to themselves as like a philanthropic organization, but they're not. This is an LLC. If they wanted to be a philanthropic nonprofit organization, they could file in a different way, of course, but they didn't choose to do that. Now, who are Laura and John Arnold? Well, they have a net worth of an estimated $3.3 billion, mostly earned in John Arnold's career running a hedge fund. Fantastic. And by the way, the Arnolds have bankrolled causes across the political spectrum, from conservative-leaning efforts to expand school choice, meaning private schools and charter schools, and overhaul public pensions, to liberal-oriented initiatives like taxing soft drinks and carbon emissions. And when they funded the pilot program in Baltimore, they, again, did not do it through a philanthropic foundation. They instead did this through an LLC. And what an LLC also helps them do is, make the transition less transparent. It's a lot more opaque to the public, and that is an issue in and of itself. And so the vicious cycle continues. Hedge fund manager and the entire financial system lobby to maintain a system of inequality, the system that we currently have, a system that drives a lot of crimes of desperation in big cities throughout the country. And then once those crimes become an issue, rather than address the inequality, we end up turning to private companies funded by former hedge fund managers that just seek to make a profit by surveilling us, by spying on us, by essentially targeting, in a lot of cases, the types of demonstrations that we saw throughout the country over the summer. And provision, I want to end with this one last example because it really does crystallize what I'm trying to say here about how private industry sees this as an opportunity. Provision, which is a company that makes nearly weightless cameras that you're supposed to put on surveillance drones, is pretty transparent about how they see this as a lucrative opportunity. In fact, Prevision's chief executive, Steve Siddharth, says one of his company's goals is to blanket entire cities with small drones, specifically surveillance drones, because that's what he's in the business of. So I am worried about what is to come from Joe Biden's administration regarding the surveillance state. But my point here is we've had a problem with this for a long time, so much so that it's been happening without the public even being aware about it. So we need to discuss real solutions to crime that we're experiencing in the country. We need to stop turning to private companies to, mitigate some of the symptoms of inequality in the country. And we need to hold local politicians and local communities accountable when they get lured into these ridiculous pilot programs that only further demonize their own citizens.
I was not aware of this spy plane story until you brought it up in the Decode chat earlier this week, and it is absolutely terrifying. I mean, okay, so here's an example of something. Twitter and Facebook banned Trump, and liberals were like, yes, finally, and some people on the left, like myself, were like, be careful with this kind of thing. Today, the Socialist Workers' Party in the UK was banned from Facebook. La Marea, which is a Spanish organization that monitors human rights abuses to migrants in Europe, was kicked off of YouTube. This very show, the Noam Chomsky interview we did, which was our most watched video, was kind of deplatformed by YouTube. Bhaskar got a notification for that.
It was demonetized, right?
Demonetized, whatever. I don't know the terms.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know what I mean. And it was affected in some way by the censors in our oligarchy. This is just the kind of thing that happens when you give the powers to do this kind of thing to unaccountable private tyrannies, right? I mean, that's just the reality of it, and that's how it starts usually, is like they do it to someone we don't like, and then it's like, oh, that feels good, I don't like those people, like, fuck them, and then but then all of a sudden what happens is it boomerangs back to the people we do like. Like, and this is like in the wake of like the Capitol Hill protests or whatever, like where there was like all this reporting about the FBI knowing about it or whatever, and it's like, talking about like their, how white supremacy was a domestic terror threat and all that stuff. They also put in the same report that Black Lives Matter was a domestic terror threat, and like, who do you think is gonna be affected by that kind of thing? I mean, and who do you think is going to be affected by the spy plane and, the expansion of military toys in the hands of law enforcement? It's going to be the people that we like eventually. I mean, that's inevitable. Which is why
Yeah.
the sort of
And I mean,
yeah.
It's been affecting the people we like for a long time. And I think I don't think this is the end all of solving the issue of, the giant tech companies. But I do think that a good first step is the effort to basically sue platforms like Facebook for their, and for antitrust violations.
Yeah.
Because you're right. I mean, look, I think I still agree with deplatforming Trump, at least temporarily, right? Like, I think after, Biden was inaugurated and, the violence died down, you can have a discussion about allowing him back on, whatever. But after what happened in the Capitol, there was legitimate concern that he was going to keep egging these guys on and people didn't want to deal with more violence. But I hear what you're saying. It is terrifying that you don't really have many options when it comes to social media because of, these monopolies. And if you're on the left and you're using these platforms effectively to mobilize people, and it's a part of your strategy, that could be absolutely devastating. But yeah, I mean, the thing that I found really fascinating, though, is it's been happening to the left for a long time.
Yeah.
And it barely gets any attention. I don't know why it is that every time a right-winger gets demonetized on YouTube, everyone, whether it's the left or the right, like they lose it together collectively. If, a show on the left gets censored, barely anyone notices, barely anyone cares, and that's been incredibly frustrating.
Well, that's a story as old as time, right? People who threaten capital are, marginalized. People who do not are, sort of played up, and that's just a reality. Like that the state, and which is an arm of capital under our system, is going to attack those who threaten capital much more than those who don't. I mean, that's just always going to be. I mean, there's always going to be people here and there. Like there's collateral damage, so to speak, or useful idiots, so to speak. Like that they kind of pick and choose on the right to make an example of or something. But the real focus, the real threat, the real effect is going to be on people on the left. That's just a tale as old as time. Whether it's local police departments or the FBI, or I mean, this last week was Martin Luther King Day, and just look at how the FBI treated Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, you know what I mean? Like it's just it's a tale as old as time. So I think that like we just have to know that going forward that this is going to happen if we empower the security state. I mean, and it's going to happen more and more as things get worse. The Daniel Bessner always talks about how the effect of a crumbling empire is that it takes the sort of tactics that it uses in the outer fringes of the empire and then brings them home. The kind of repression that happens, drone surveillance and all that stuff that happens all over the world is going to end up just coming here. We're going to have little buzzy drones outside my window over here, checking on whatever I'm doing here, reading my little decode segment as I'm writing it to make sure that I'm not saying anything too dangerous or something, So yeah, I mean, it's just, that's the reality. I mean, that's why it's so dangerous to cheer on and empower these security apparatuses when they target people we don't like. That's been the consistent argument for things like the ACLU defending the free speech rights of Nazis, which is a very controversial thing they've been doing for decades. And it obviously makes people very uncomfortable, and I can see why. But what they make the argument is that the principle is the important thing to defend, because they're not. Who gives? They're not like they're unimportant. They're not really like a threat to anything right now. what is a threat is the violation of the principle, because that will rebound on the people that we do like. So, yeah.
Like, I slightly disagree with you. I'm not a fan of censorship. I think that there are extreme cases where it makes sense. So I totally agreed with deplatforming Alex Jones, considering, the fact that he was targeting a family who lost a son in the Sandy Hook shooting. And they had to move 7 times. Like, inciting violence isn't protected under the Constitution. I don't like the argument of, oh, it's a private company, so they don't even have to abide by the First Amendment. But what I do think is important, right, aside from the whole antitrust effort that's taking place right now, is this is a form of communication that should be thought of as a public utility. And once it's once it's considered a public utility, then the constitutional protections do apply to it. And as we know, there are limitations to the First Amendment. So, and the limitations are very specific. Inciting violence does not get any type of constitutional protection under the First Amendment. And so I just think that the decisions that would be made under a public utility would be much better. And more importantly, there isn't a profit motive behind it. Because look, the Chomsky video that we did, and this is not an excuse for what happened. I just want people to understand why it happened. The reason why the Chomsky video was demonetized is because advertisers don't want to be on that kind of content, because that's the kind of content that challenges capital, right? And so if you're dealing with a public utility, then you don't get deplatformed or demonetized or whatever. I mean, I don't think it would even be monetized, but you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like you think that Twitter banned all of those QAnon folks because they're actually concerned about what those folks are going to do to this country? No, they don't care about that. They allowed that stuff to run rampant the entire time until the riots took place. Facebook did the same thing. Once they realize that advertisers are going to run away and their whole business model is going to collapse or potentially collapse, that's when they purge all the people who pose a threat to their profit motive.
I mean,
I think
the extent that there should be regulation in this kind of thing, it should be, like you said, democratically and transparently done. And I agree that there are instances potentially in which you could make an argument for certain regulations on type of media or the type of things that people say or whatever, like yelling, like yelling fire in a theater when there's no, things like that.
yeah.
But those are decided democratically through a democratic process and applied transparently through some standards that we have all kind of come together and decided upon. That's just not the case right now, and that's just not the case of what this kind of thing is happening. And again, these efforts by private companies, both in the security state and in social media and all that stuff, they're completely unaccountable and completely outside of democratic control. Therefore, they're going to be bad. I mean, by definition, there is no scenario in which they're not going to be that way. I mean, they're gonna sprinkle some little bitty like deplorables that we don't like into the mix to keep us distracted, but the vast majority of it is gonna be affecting us. So.